we've really had a wonderful talk on developmental biology, and we're going to move a little bit to genetics, although we'll see there's a lot of overlap here, a lot of integration in these two talks. And before I start, I want to just thank Nell Whiteway, who's the lady on this screen there, who's my research assistant at the Faraday Institute. And Nell has done a lot of the research work, researching the literature, really, literature research, to do with the topic that we have today. In fact, the topic we have today, I gave 4 lectures on this, the Gifford lectures, a couple of years ago, and so this is more like a kind of abstract, really, of some ideas coming out of those Gifford lectures. I want to start today by suggesting that there are really 2 rather different understandings of contemporary genetics. The first is what we might call the popular media understanding, and as I'm going to illustrate in a moment, this really has 2 main features. First of all, in the media reporting especially, I'm talking about international media, I imagine it may be the same here in Argentina, genes are seen rather as deterministic agents that control our destinies. And secondly, also, genes are seen as somehow as being in competition with the influence of the environment. We'll come back to that kind of idea in just a moment. And then we have the contemporary academic understanding of genetics, which is, I think, a much more integrated understanding of the role of genetics in human personhood. And that's where I want to focus today. And we're going to bring that understanding into conversation with theology. And so let's see how we go. Now, it's an unfortunate fact that some academics actually contribute to the popular misunderstanding of the role of the genes. And here's an example from a recent News and Views section in Nature, where we have somebody there reporting, and I quote from Nature, this is 2012, "An increasing number of studies suggest that biology can exert a significant influence on political beliefs and behaviors." And its writer suggests that genes could exert a pull on attitudes concerning topics such as abortion, immigration, the death penalty, and pacifism. And then we have John Hibbing, a political scientist who's at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the United States, and he's quoted in this same article as saying that it's difficult to change someone's mind about political issues because their reactions are rooted in their physiology. Okay, so note here the assumption of determinism. Genes and physiology also are seen as something different from us and our mind. Our genes and our physiology seem to be controlling us, so we can't even change our mind. So here's a quite deterministic narrative in a scientific journal, a very respected scientific journal, very recently. I think the recent sequencing of the human genome has also accelerated the use of deterministic language in the media. You get headlines such as this one: "Human genome encodes the blueprint of life." And often the genome is seen as some sort of engineering manual. You need a manual to build a bridge. Okay, so you have a manual from your engineer, and so now we have the genome sequenced. That's like a manual, how to build a human being. This is the kind of idea that you sometimes get in the media and sometimes amongst scientists as well. And thinking also of the media reporting, we have a lot of headlines about discoveries of a gene for this, that, or the other. There are mean genes, there are gluttony genes, there are gangster genes, there are liberal genes, there are religious genes. There was even someone suggested in the British newspaper The Guardian recently that there might be a gene that predisposes some people to think that behavior is determined by genes. If you could follow that, that's a bit complicated. But, so you get this sort of rhetoric of genetic determinism coming out in the media. So it's worth emphasizing, of course, there is no single gene that encodes any kind of behavior in any living organism, let alone humans. That simply does not exist. So there's a lot of miscommunication here in the public understanding of science. And a further problem comes from the use of the language of nature and nurture. I don't know how this translates into Spanish, but this is a very long history of these two words, nature and nurture, in the English language. And this kind of dichotomous language, of course, comes from Francis Galton, who was a first cousin of Charles Darwin, and he introduced the language in his rather famous book of Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture, 1874. As Galton himself pointed out, the phrase nature and nurture is a convenient jingle of words. He rather liked this balance of words here. And it's true that this phrasing, nature and nurture, has dominated a lot of the discussion about genes and environment during the course of the last century. But he himself, Francis Galton, clearly thought that it was nature that was really on top. It was nature that has the most powerful influence. He says here, the no carefulness of nurture can overcome the evil tendencies of an intrinsically bad physique, a weak brain, or brutal disposition. Okay, he's a Victorian writer, so the language is a little bit dramatic here, but he really thought that nature really was the most powerful kind of idea there was. And so today you get the media often talking about the nature versus nurture debate, as if you have kind of two essences, one called nature over here and one called nurture over there, and they're in some sort of fight. And, which one is going to win? And so that's how the science is often presented in the media. So what you get out of that narrative is a very fragmented picture of human personhood. Here we have nature and nurture somehow at war inside human beings. Now, when we move, of course, to the academic understanding, as we've already been seeing, we have a very, very different kind of picture of developmental biology and its building of humans and so on. So I want to think a little bit this morning then about the integration between genes and environment, also during the course of human development as well. And I want to use an acronym, D-I-C-I, DICE. I'm going to call it DICE. It's actually a Latin word, which means to be said, but the acronym is standing here for something different. It's standing for developmental, integrated, complementary interactionism. Okay, so four words, which I'm going to use as a kind of framework for thinking about human personhood from a biological perspective and then also from a theological perspective as well. And this is the kind of language that really undermines the idea of nature and nurture as being in some sort of opposition, genes and environment as somehow being in opposition, and so on. Now, we've already been hearing a lot, this excellent previous talk by Dr. Aquino about developmental biology. I almost thought I would take out the next few slides because we've already been through some developmental biology. But I kept them in because I wanted to really emphasize the role of the environments, plural, in the development of humans. And I thought it would be, again, interesting to start, again, we've already been through this, but a slightly different angle here, starting with our fertilized egg, the zygote, and thinking about how the integration of signals and the environment occur during human development. It's good to remember that, of course, what we inherit from our parents is not naked DNA. It's actually a rather complex system. Naked DNA by itself can do nothing. It needs all that molecular machinery that we were hearing about before. It needs all those protein transcription factors. It needs DNA, RNA, and so on and so forth. If you look in the mother's egg at fertilization, just before fertilization, I mean, it's a very complex system that we are inheriting here. We have at least 3,000 proteins. There are around 7,500 different messenger RNA molecules. There are thousands of small regulatory non-coding RNA molecules. So what we're inheriting here is not naked DNA, as I say. We're inheriting a very complicated system. And so by itself, DNA would be as useless as having, let's say, a CD with a computer program on it, but no computer to actually run the software. You need a system to make biological things work. And right from the beginning, we've got these two kinds of environment, two types of environment. Excuse me, we've got the immediate environment of the DNA in the cell, which we've already been hearing about, the whole molecular machinery. So that's the kind of environment that switches genes on and off and which regulates the genome and so on and so forth. But then we've got the broader environment. We've got that fallopian tube with the zygote going down the fallopian tube and then interacting with the physiology of the mother. And then we have the mother's broader environment. We've got the mother's social relationships. We've got where she lives, her own experiences of life. We've got those macro environments. So I'm going to be talking about microenvironments within the cell and the macro environments, the broader, as it were, interactions that go on all the time. And of course, a key part of that microenvironment of the gene is other genes, and genes behave according to their own microenvironment. So just like people, they depend on what other genes are around them and what those genes are doing. We already heard about those hundreds of transcription factors that regulate the switching on of genes and switching off. There's a great big project going on at the moment called the Encode Project, which has just published a lot more papers. And the aim of the Encode Project is to find out what every single part of the genome does. And it turns out that at least 20% of the genome, genome is just that complete set of DNA nucleotides, 3.2 billion nucleotides. So about 20%, it may be more, it's still a bit controversial exactly how much is involved in regulation, involved in switching genes on and off. And in the early zygote, it's actually the proteins, the transcription factors that come from the mother's egg that begin development. So development is started by proteins, which then begin to switch genes on and off in the newly fertilized egg. So this is female power, so actually it's, the female proteins which start things off. If you want to make a feminist narrative, you can do that, but maybe not now. But there you've got kind of causal networks operating in all directions going on there as well. So as soon as you get implantation, then again, the fetus is now exposed to a huge array of environmental influences. They come, of course, from the blood circulation via the placenta. So the fetus is now getting oxygen and hormones and glucose and proteins, maybe alcohol, maybe drugs, all kinds of things are becoming available. And by the third trimester, months 6 to 9, that fetus, that embryo, can taste certain things, can smell, can hear certain stimuli inside the womb in ways that have impacts on the behavior of the baby following birth. And then, of course, at birth, the newborn is now kind of bombarded with this huge array of new experiences. And so you've got all these sights and sounds and smells and touch and language and people and cats and dogs and everything is just suddenly, whew. And we've all been through that and somehow survived. But there's a huge amount of new environmental information pouring into that poor little baby once it's just been born. And as we were hearing also, the infant brain is not really a miniature version of the adult brain, but it's actually a self-organizing system that only self-assembles correctly if you get the right inputs at the right time. So our adult brains contain about 10 to the 11 neurons, but in total twice as many neurons are made in the fetal development, and then there's a lot of pruning. So half of the neurons made are pruned away in the kind of ways that we were hearing earlier during neuronal development. And as we were hearing also, those fetal brain cells before birth are actually immature neuroblasts. They don't even begin to get myelinated properly until shortly before birth and then mostly after birth, as Dr. Kuhner was explaining for us. So it's the experiences of the growing brain which actually help to shape the structure, the synaptic architecture of the brain. And if you look at that synaptic density in those months after birth, you can see how incredibly rapidly it's growing in the first 2 years of life. And so that just illustrates the density of synaptic density in the newborn brain. In fact, the average weight of the human brain triples during the first year of life. It goes up from about 300 grams to 900 grams even during the first year. And that's not because of new neurons, that's because of myelination, because of this increased density of synaptic connections and so on. There's a huge amount of brain development and formation going on during this critical period. And there are also, as you surely know, there are certain critical periods at which it is really essential to have the right environmental inputs for the development of specific brain areas. And so if a baby is blind from birth and that's not detected, not corrected, then the visual cortex, the back here, doesn't develop properly, and you can get permanent visual impairment unless that is corrected. And so children who are also born with congenital cataracts in both eyes, they have large permanent deficits in motion processing as well. They can't stand up properly. They need that for their organization of those brain centers which help them to organize their position in relation to gravity and the world and so on. But if that child develops cataracts from the age of 6 to 12 months, then there is no defect in motion processing. So it's just that critical window which is so important for proper brain development. So the point I want to put across here is that it's really the environment in collaboration with this growing brain which builds the new adult brain. And so it's a completely integrated process. And as we go on into adulthood, then we still continue with this integrated interactionism between the genes, the microenvironments, the macroenvironments. In fact, they become even more striking because here we have now the growing individual who makes their own decisions in life, and their lifestyle choices will impact upon their genomes every day, every moment of the day. What we eat, the exercise we take, or the exercise we don't take. Also our relationships, whether we choose to live in lonely contexts or social contexts, how much alcohol we drink, whether we take drugs, and so on and so on. All of these are impacting on the epigenome that we were just hearing about to influence the regulation of gene expression, the switching on and the switching off of genes. And we heard already about epigenetics and the absolutely key role that plays in the way the environment speaks to us. The environment speaks to us through epigenetic modifications. I won't pause on that because we've already had that explained to us very nicely. So that's developmental, integrated, complementary interactionism. So we've seen how the development then of the organism is the key. That's the ongoing process that continues until death. All of these components are very tightly integrated, and there's a continual interaction between all the various components of the genomic system, the microenvironments and the macroenvironments. We've got here many complementary processes happening in parallel. And that really undermines, I think, the idea of a dichotomous language or a dichotomous fragmented picture of the human. So I think what Dicey does, what this does, is to really put to one side this language of nature and nurture or genes and environment and so on. It's simply the goalposts have been moved, if you like. We've created a new framework here for understanding human personhood. And what it's also saying is that 100% of the phenotype, that is the appearance, the morphology, the characteristics of any complex organism involves genetics, and 100% involves the environment. So this is not putting down genetics and pushing up the environment, or the other way around. It's not pushing down the environment, pushing up genetics. It's just saying this is a complex system where you have complete integration between all these different components. Now, we've been thinking a lot about the development in the last talk and now the development of biological organisms. So I thought it might be useful to think about development as something slightly different. the development of a chocolate cake. Okay, this is just an illustration. Okay, you understand. Okay, it's a slightly less complex system, although a chocolate cake is actually quite complicated. So most of this cake, this is a real recipe, by the way. So most of the cake is flour. It's 50% actually is flour, and clearly if you have no flour, you will get no cake. Less than 1% of this cake is baking powder, but if you don't have that 1%, you won't get a cake, that's for sure. Around 8% is chocolate powder, and so no chocolate powder, then no chocolate cake. Then you have to put it in the correct oven, you've got to get the correct heat. And so the cake is actually the product of a highly complex developmental process in which the proportions of the recipe are indeed very important indeed. They're critical to the eventual outcome. But actually, it would be odd, it would be, in fact, impossible to try and assign proportionality to the original components once the cake has been baked. Because, for example, the baking powder in the final cake no longer exists. It's disappeared. It's been chemically transformed. The flour has been chemically transformed. So the cake as a whole has emergent properties which are non-reducible to its initial components. Well, that's pretty similar to human beings, only we're a bit more complicated than a cake. Now we can start asking questions then. For example, would human personalities be as different as they are without these variant genomes that we all have? We all vary in about 1 out of 1,000 genetic letters, nucleotide bases in our alphabets. Well, I want to say certainly not in answer to that question. Those variant genomes are really playing a very critical role. They're a necessary part of the story. But equally, I think it would be mistaken to try and say that a particular genome causes a particular personality. In reality, there are many tributaries of the river of life. That's why I've shown a river with tributaries there. We've got many tributaries flowing together in this developmental process to integrate, to form the big river, which is my picture here of the river of the individual life. And so human life starts with the inheritance of a complex system, and it's that with those sort of dynamic characteristics of that ongoing complex system that we are going to find human identity. In fact, if you take human individuals randomly picked from anywhere in the world, it turns out we vary altogether by quite a high proportion of our genome, actually. It's about 0.5% up to 1%, something like that, based on whole genome studies. And new mutations are constantly being added to the human gene pool. It's recently been estimated based on whole genome sequencing that each newborn contains on average about 60 new mutations in their DNA that are not present in their parents. That's about 15 from the mother, and the rest comes from the father, depending on the age of the father. This is a much bigger difference, actually, than we had expected. Now, of course, most of those differences don't make any difference at all because they're in non-coding regions of the genome, and we don't have to worry about them, but clearly some of those differences really do make a difference. And it's really the task of behavioral geneticists and molecular geneticists and so on to try and find out, what kind of differences those mutations will make. And that can only really be studied for, certainly for behavioral genetics and also some medical genetics, if we're going to use twin studies, identical twins, non-identical twins, adopted children, and so on, and really have a look at that huge field. This, of course, raises the question of genetic determinism. Determinism, of course, refers to people, individuals, and to their choices. No philosopher can really agree on a definition of determinism, so I'm just going to give you my definitions for the sake of this talk. I think we can broadly divide our definitions into hard forms and soft forms of determinism. So hard genetic determinism is the thesis that given our particular genomes, our lives are not really up to us and are constrained to follow one particular future. It's a pretty hard form of genetic determinism. There is a softer form of genetic determinism that is the thesis that given our particular genomes, our lives are more likely to follow one particular future. Well, you might say that's not really determinism at all, but let's just keep those definitions in mind as we proceed. Now, in practice, of course, we're all on some sort of spectrum in our beliefs about free will and determinism, and we're not going to get into the philosophy of that, but just to point out, at one end of the spectrum, we have these really hard forms of genetic determinism. At the other extreme, we have a kind of total existential freedom, the blank slate, and so on, and most of us are somewhere along that spectrum, I'm sure. Now, I would say that hard genetic determinism really belongs to medical genetics, where often a single point mutation, a single mutation in a gene can lead to disease, which leads to death, and basically, in many cases, there is nothing you can do about it. That is really hard medical genetic determinism, because the life of that individual is constrained by those circumstances to one particular future, which is very likely to happen. And I've spent quite a bit of my life working on those kinds of diseases. But the softer form probably belong more to behavioral molecular genetics and that whole huge field that we don't have time to look at in detail, but here, through genome-wide association studies, there is the search for risk factors, genetic mutations that will increase slightly the possibility of developing a trait which is a behavioral trait and so forth. And so there's a huge field there that we don't really have time to look in detail. I simply want to ask, thinking about the implications, the moral and theological implications of those studies, I want to ask a question this morning, which I think can be quite informative. Let's ask the question, could there be a single gene associated with a 25-fold higher relative risk of being a criminal? And could that exist? Well, actually, it does exist, and we have a name for it, and it's called the SRY gene. It's found on the Y chromosome. And if you look at 131 countries worldwide, an average of 96% of the prisoners are male. Okay, so what is the gene that characterizes those male population? Well, it's the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. This is the gene that defines our maleness, that stops us developing as females. The default of every human embryo is to develop into a female, unless you have the SRY gene. Okay, so what do we do about that? That's a 25-fold higher risk factor of being a criminal. What do we do about that? Well, we don't do anything, really. Basically, we want to find out if the person is guilty, and if they're guilty, we put them in jail. And we don't let criminals off because they're male. We don't say, oh, well, I'm sorry you're male. You have the SRY gene. It's not your fault. And I think that's quite an interesting illustration, because there's a huge field of genetics to do with criminality and aggression and so on, but none of the genes variants discovered so far will give you a 25-fold higher risk of criminality. So I think that helps us, thinking about the examples we already have, perhaps will help us to think about those other examples where people want to build deterministic views of human personhood. Basically, taking the field of behavioral molecular genetics overall, I think we have a picture emerging here of thousands of variant genes which, taken together, help the development of our unique human personalities that we see all around us. I think the data are entirely consistent with developmental integrated complementary interactionism. And so variant genomes which are unique to every person on the earth are surely intimately involved in the development of those broad swathes of our personalities which make us unique and distinct, that guarantee our uniqueness, but not in a deterministic way, but in a way that is completely integrated with our experiences of life and with the decisions that we make. I want to spend the second part of this lecture really thinking about the interaction of this development picture that we've both been presenting this morning with theological issues. Now, let me just say it at the beginning here, as we ask the question, what has theology got to do with genetics? What this conversation is not about. The conversation is not about this discredited God of the gaps idea that we were thinking about yesterday. We're not trying to look for gaps in our genetic story or an environmental story and somehow place God, our theology, in those gaps. No, that's not what this is about. We're certainly not trying to put down the science in any way in order to view theology in a more favorable light. Not at all. We're accepting the whole scientific story. It's a story, a dynamic story, which is, of course, changing. But we need to view that story very seriously and then to start thinking about the conversation that we can have with theology. Now, the conversation really that I want to have this morning is with a very ancient idea in Judeo-Christian thought, and that's the idea of the imago Dei, or humankind being made in the image of God. And this, of course, is an idea that has played a huge role in Christian thought and political thought, social thought, over the past centuries. And I want us to use the idea of the imago Dei as a bridge to bring genetics and science in conversation with theology and to think about the scientific and theological understandings of human personhood. And of course, irrespective of whether we ourselves believe in God or not, it's quite clear that the understanding of the imago Dei, the humankind made in the image of God, has had a huge impact in these past centuries on moral values, political systems, medical care, education, justification of human rights, and so on. It was a central part of the anti-slavery campaign of the early part of the 19th century, and so on. It's just been a very, very central idea. And of course, huge books have been written about it. I'm well aware there's a vast amount of writing on this, and so my comments are going to be probably fairly superficial this morning because of lack of time to develop, but let's just think really how the Bible presents to us this understanding in the first few chapters of Genesis. In fact, we only have 3 uses of the image of God language in those early chapters. Most famously here, Genesis 1, verse 26, God said, "Let us make Adam, let us make humankind in our image and our likeness. Let them," plural, "rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created Adam, humankind, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. So that's the first declaration. It's like a kind of, I see it as a manifesto literature. This is the manifesto for the whole of the rest of the Bible. Without it, we cannot understand what the Bible is talking about. But it raises a question. How would the early readers of such a text really understand this language of being made in the image of God? And as is often pointed out by theologians and by students of Near East culture and so on, an important clue comes from those many contemporary texts that speak about the king as being in the divine image of one of those polytheistic gods that were so popular in the Babylonian, Sumerian cultures, Egyptian cultures of the Near East of that time. I just want to give one example of that. Here is a 7th century BC Assyrian king. He's Esarhaddon. He's being addressed by one of his correspondents, the astrologer and court official Adad Shum Osur, and he's being addressed as the image of the god Bel, Marduk. And he writes like this. He says, "A free man is as the shadow of God, the slave is as the shadow of a free man, but the king, he is like unto the very image of God." And there's quite a number of interesting texts like that from the Mesopotamian literature and far more in the Egyptian literature of the time. So many people think that when the early readers of Genesis were reading this phrase, image of God, they would have started thinking about divinity. They would have started thinking about kingship. They would have actually started encountering a kind of completely new idea of understanding humankind. Because here we have these kingly and priestly roles, which have been previously assigned to a privileged few by a pantheon of gods. These are now delegated instead by the one creator God to the whole of humanity. So here we have humankind created with dignity and with worth and called to play a kind of kingly role in looking after God's creation, like an ambassador, if you like, on this earth. The key point here is the kingly and priestly role. Sometimes the language of image of God was also used of the priests of the time. And so the kingly and priestly roles, which had previously been allocated to this privileged few, just the top people, they were now being delegated instead by the one creator God to the whole of humanity. And so we can say the imago Dei was being democratized. It was being taken from an idea for the privileged few, and it was being declared as a privilege belonging to the whole of humanity, male and female. He created them. Now, there are four particular strands in this idea of humankind made in the image of God that I would like to bring into conversation with genetics. And first of all is this value and status of each human individual, irrespective of their genetic status. I think there was a time when the image of God was thought of more as a kind of list of characteristics that distinguish humans from animals, like rationality, creativity, consciousness, and you make this kind of list. Now, clearly that's an important point. That's an important list. But I would say it's necessary but not sufficient for a more theological understanding here of what the image of God is all about. I don't think those ideas really get to the heart of what Genesis is really talking about. Instead, I think we see more this idea of a delegated value of status which is bestowed by God that exists irrespective of human frailty and transience of human life. In other words, the value and status of humankind here is established not by some list of things that people have, but actually by divine decree, by God saying that you humankind, are made in the image of God. This is a status that you did not have before, and this is, as it were, by divine command or by divine purpose. And so this is really important when it comes to genetic variation, because it means that people are not valued because of their particular genetic endowment, and especially this is very relevant when it comes to genetic disabilities and genetic disease as well. Individuals who have the misfortune to suffer from genetic disease are as much in the image of God as anybody else. And so the fact of humankind being made in God's image undermines any kind of move to make distinctions between people based upon their race or their genetic endowment, genetic capabilities, and so on. Now, I want to give you one illustration of what happens. It's a rather frightening illustration, actually, I find. A frightening illustration of what happens when ethicists lose their roots of humankind being made in the image of God. This is from the journal, which journal is it? It's a Journal of Medical Ethics, 2012. And it comes from a paper where these two writers, these two ethicists, are suggesting that prenatal diagnosis is fine and that's okay, but as a matter of fact, some babies get novel mutations as we were thinking, and so what happens to babies after birth if they have some severe genetic abnormality? Should we not practice after birth abortion? Okay, this is the article, after birth abortion. Now that is kind of, we call it Orwellian language. I mean, this is not really after birth abortion. This is infanticide. Let's call it the proper name here, infanticide. And so they're trying to justify infanticide based on the utilitarian argument. It's the argument you find in Peter Singer as well, that here the baby is not wanted, it has some terrible genetic abnormality. Wouldn't it be much kinder, wouldn't it be much more positive to kill the baby soon after birth? And the authors don't seem to be aware of course, that this was exactly what was practiced in the early centuries of the Roman Empire, early centuries AD, until Christian thought was able to change that, and the law was changed. But as you know, babies in those early centuries of the Roman Empire, if they were not wanted, they would be exposed on the hillside to die. There was infanticide, was practiced quite widely, and it was only changed through the Christianization of the Roman Empire at that time. And these writers seem to be unaware of that whole history. But the point I mention here is, the reason I show it is that when we lose a sense of an absolute value of human individuals, then utilitarian arguments become very powerful, and this is where it kind of goes, and it probably wouldn't stop there either. Okay, the second strand I'd like to draw out in this conversation between genetics and the Imago Dei is the sheer physicality of the Genesis teaching about the image of God. Here we have humankind as the embodied self. That's sort of picked up and developed right throughout the Old Testament scriptures. So humankind are not spirits, they're not angels, they're not ghosts, they're made from dust, they're very physical beings. And so in Genesis 2:7 we have the Lord God formed, he yatsar, he formed Adam from the Adama, he formed dusty Adam from the dust, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the Adam became a nefesh, the Adam became a living being. It wasn't given the nefesh as a sort of added extra, the Adam became a living being. And as we go through, I think, the Old Testament, we see in Hebrew thought, in fact, the word soul and spirit are often used interchangeably in the Old Testament many times. And they kind of got an integrated view there of human personhood. It's not a fragmented view. It has different aspects, but it's a much more unified view that you get perhaps later on in Greek thought. And I'd like to suggest that this kind of resonates quite well with DICE, with developmental integrated complementary interactionism, in which all the components of human personhood are interacting in one integrated process. So it's not a question, we don't have bodies, we are our bodies. We don't have bodies, we are our bodies. We are our genomes just as much as we are our epigenetics. We are our brains with their 10 to the 14 synaptic connections, and so on. So far from being a sort of fragmented being that you get so often now in genes versus environment, certainly in Hebrew thought, I think, you have this reveling in the sheer wonder of this physical integration of personhood. That resonates very well with DICE. If we go forward to the New Testament, we don't have time to really develop that thought, but we find the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Corinth about the resurrection of the body and about the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth in particular. He's reminding his readers that just as we are born the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. A very nice, interesting integration there between the man of dust and the man of heaven. And so the Christian's eschatological hope lies not in some vague component of personhood which is isolated from physicality, but it lies in the resurrection of the transformed body. The third resonance that we note between the idea of the image of God and our genetic identity is its insistence that it involves diversity. Male and female, he created them. This is what the theologian Karl Barth claimed as the definitive explanation given by the text itself of the image of God. And so in Barth's view, the key to the meaning of God's image in humankind is this reciprocal relationship of human being with human being and between the person and God. I actually think Barth perhaps slightly overstated the case, but I think there's a really important truth here. So the image is not some static status quo. It's not some list of human characteristics. But here we have a dynamic, ongoing developmental process carried out in relationship. So I like to see it not like a mirror, but more like a prism, in which God delegates responsibilities through the whole human social community, in which male and female are collaborating together. And so it's a relational, dynamic concept. And I think this theological account coheres very well with this kind of biological story that we've been providing of Dicey, a story that focuses on the development of diversity, that guarantees the uniqueness of every human being. Not even identical twins are really identical, of course. So it's not that cloned human beings could not have personal relationships, but that could be a little bit tricky. But rather, I think meaningful relationships would certainly be very challenging if we were all one great big clone, a big cloned population. So far from seeing this striking diversity in the whole human population as some kind of threat, people sometimes feel threatened by genetic data, I see it as a gift from God. It's a gift from God that guarantees our variation and this wonderful diversity in the human population that I think that we should really celebrate. We should celebrate the diversity, and because it's a reflection of being made in the image of God. It's all part of God's purposes. The fourth point we notice in the idea of the image of God is this entailment of moral responsibilities and duties placed upon mankind. This involves, of course, genuine choice. That seems very obvious to us now that we have real personal moral choices. I think it was not at all obvious in the context in which Genesis was being finalized, in the context of a Mesopotamian cultures in which there were very fixed social roles, in which everybody has their fixed role in life, and there was no democracy, there was no democratization of the whole of the human community at that time. And so in those ancient societies, the socio-political order was seen as a kind of microcosm of the larger world of the gods. The polytheism of the gods, the hierarchy amongst the gods, was reproduced in the social hierarchies of the rulers and the serfs, the people who worked in the fields, and so on. And so if you deviated from that kind of picture, your life would be threatened. You would be seen as a revolutionary, a subversive, and so on. So free choice didn't really come into the question. But here, by contrast, in Genesis, this delegated responsibility of caring for the earth was given to the whole of humankind. And so, in a stroke, you have the entire ruling and priestly structure of Mesopotamian society was delegitimized. Genesis is a very subversive text. It's a very revolutionary text in the context of its time, because here you have one type of creation order which is being subverted and replaced by another. And then you get this very clear choice. The command is given in Genesis 2 not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Of course, the command is disobeyed, human autonomy seems much more attractive, and there are terrible consequences, the separation from the tree of life. So the assumption here of genuine human responsibility is inescapable in this text, in the early chapters of Genesis. That's totally different from Babylonian texts. Free will is not a discussion point in Babylonian philosophy. So here you get human responsibility as being central to the theological understanding of humankind made in the image of God. So those are a few thoughts to begin a discussion, between genetics and between the image of God. So in conclusion then, we've seen there's really nothing in contemporary genetics. I haven't given you all the data on this, that would take too long. Apart from some rare but tragic cases of medical genetic pathologies, there's really nothing that would undermine, subvert this idea of personal moral responsibility. And I've been trying to suggest that genes do not influence us and certainly do not control us, as if our genomes were somehow operating in some separate space isolated from the rest of personhood. And we've been suggesting also there are no genes for individual human behavioral traits, gluttony, no genes for impetuosity, there's no gene for crime, there's no gene for religiosity, a single gene, there's no gene for voting for one political party over another, and so forth. And so the take-home message is we really cannot escape our responsibilities to God and to each other, and indeed to the earth, as we will be hearing later on today, I think. And we will be called to account for our actions, and that's the challenging part, isn't it, I think, of this kind of understanding. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, sir.